In this video, I want to talk a little bit about springtime cold fronts and what we can do as anglers to kind of combat against these fronts. I think a lot of us anglers deal with this often. You know, it's getting warmer in the spring. We're kind of transitioning from spring to winter. And during that time, you will have these massive cold fronts right when you think things are getting good, and then it just kind of ruins fishing for a little bit. And in this video, I want to talk about a few things you can still do to go out and catch fish. Now, real quick before we get into the video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. I am running a deal for the rest of March, so just a few more days here. If you buy one of my USA-made sun shirts, one of the only ones out there in the market, you can get one of my bass hats for 50% off. And that's a bass hat with a wooden bass badge on the front. So all you gotta do is add the shirt you like to cart, add the hat that you like to cart. It will automatically discount at checkout. I will leave a link down below in the description. It is the best way to help support this channel. All right, let's talk about springtime cold fronts. And here's the thing is that, you know, depending on what type of body of water you are fishing, a springtime cold front is going to have kind of drastically different outcomes on that body of water. For example, you know, if you fish more lowland reservoirs that maybe don't have as much deep water and they maybe don't have as much clear water a lot of times, those tend to be more impacted by cold fronts than other reservoirs, especially lakes that have deep water, especially lakes that have clear water. Because a lot of times what happens in the spring on like lowland style or smaller lakes that are shallower, you will have water that warms up really, really quickly because that sun starts to pop out. Maybe you have a few of those warm weather days in the springtime. Everything starts to warm up and the fish start to get very active very quick. You will see a number of fish start to move up shallow. You see a lot of bait fish, bluegill, shad that will be in nothing water. They will be in this much water very, very quickly because they're trying to absorb some of that warmth. And sometimes you will find bass following those bait fish, feeding up on those bait fish already, and you can start to catch them. Now, the problem is that when you have these cold fronts that come in, especially on, like I said, those lowland lakes, those lakes that don't have a ton of depth, it will really kill the bass fishing because it can actually bring the water temperatures down very, very quickly. I mean, if you're fishing, I've been on lakes before where there will be a 12-degree water change overnight, where it was 60 degrees one day and you wake up the next day and it's 48. And if you have something like that happen on a lake, it is going to drastically impact the bass. Now, one of the biggest things that I like to do is always try to find areas that have some sort of deeper water close by. And that's why I do like to fish, you know, more midland and highland type reservoirs that have a lot of deep water in them because they don't tend to get as impacted by these cold fronts that come through. But even if you're fishing a lake that's shallower, maybe it's a lowland like I talked about, you know, if you can find areas that have just a little bit more depth close by where those fish can kind of move off to in a smaller motion, that's the key here. If you have deep water in an area that's really close, bass only have to shift down a lot of times. They only have to move maybe a couple of feet. If you have an area that's a big flat, maybe it's 2-3 foot, you have lay downs, you know, those fish will really get in those areas when it's warm, but as soon as it's cold, I don't always necessarily think that those fish run to the deepest water close by. Sometimes I think they stay there, but they will not bite. If you have a 12-degree water change overnight, those fish are going to be very inactive, very lockjaw. So finding these areas that have at least some sort of depth close to them is really, really key during this time of the year. And depth is definitely relative. You know, like I said, on a highland reservoir, this may be having 20 feet of water close by. But on those lowland type reservoirs or those flatter lakes, it may be, you know, 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot, just something that is deep for that body of water. That is really, really important. Now, another thing that I think is really important that will help you to catch fish, especially when those cold fronts hit and like the day after it hits, is to really slow down. You know, a lot of times when a front is approaching, you can use a lot of faster moving baits and catch them, chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, topwaters even. But when you have these springtime cold fronts that come through and it does kill that water temp a little bit, even if you have those deeper water areas close by, I still think a lot of times the best way to catch fish is by slowing down and trying to hit that fish on the head. You know, a lot of times I found, these areas that have wood in them. And sometimes those fish will get right up inside that wood. They kind of more or less stage in that wood. They get kind of bundled up in that wood while this cold front is passing before they move back out until that flat maybe area where they're going to spawn. And so a lot of times I'm going to slow down. I like a tube, if I'm being 100% honest with you. That is my number one probably cold front style lure, is a Texas rigged tube. And the reason that I like it is a tube is a very subtle bait. It doesn't have a lot of flapping arms. It doesn't have a lot of appendages that are creating a bunch of action. So when you're dealing with a little bit colder water temps, it looks more natural to a bass. The other reason that I like a tube is because I think it just gets a lot more bites than baits like a jig. Typically in the springtime, I love fishing a jig, but when you have those hard cold fronts come in, I think sometimes that bigger presence that a jig puts off, not all the time, 100% not all the time, but sometimes a bigger presence that a jig puts off will tend to lead to less bites. You still may get some bites on them and they still may be some hammers, and that's typically what jig fishing is. But I like a tube, a Texas rigged tube. A lot of times I'm going to throw it on big line, maybe 20-pound line. If I'm fishing it in like direct cover, I'll fish it in 20-pound line. If I'm fishing more like 45-degree angle banks, I'm just kind of working it down, I might fish it on 15-pound line, something that gives me a little bit more control over that bait. So guys, those are kind of the things that I like to do in the spring when I have these cold front conditions. We all have them. Now, one thing I did want to mention is natural lakes, because there's a lot of you that watch these videos that you live around more natural lakes. And the good thing about natural lakes, primarily you have a lot of natural lakes like in places like Florida and a little bit in the South, and you have a lot on the West Coast, and then you have a lot kind of in the north. And in the northern part of the country, I think cold fronts are less impactful than in kind of the mid part of the country, because those fish are just used to it. You have northern strain largemouth, you have a lot of smallmouth. Those fish are used to cold water. They're used to it. They don't have quite the impact. It just doesn't have the impact that it does in a lot of these other reservoirs across the country. And the other thing about natural lakes is they tend to be clearer, and they tend to have they can have an abundance of water, a big volume, I guess you could say, of water. Because sometimes these natural lakes are big, they'll have deep sections, even though they're more sloping, they'll have deep sections. And because there's so much volume of water there, the water temps don't go up and down quite as much as they do again in some of those Midwest or southern parts of the country, where it'll be 80 degrees one day and it'll be 20 degrees at night, and you'll have this big temperature swing. You don't see that quite as much in the north. Like you do, but you don't see it quite as much. And those fish are just used to it. I still think one of the best baits to use in the north in clear water is a jerk bait. Even after a cold front, a jerk bait can be a really good lure to use up in the north. Again, you're dealing with a lot of smallmouth. Smallmouth just love jerk baits, and even dealing with northern strain largemouth, which tend to like a lot of jerk baits as well. So those are what I do a lot of times when I am fishing in the spring and I have those cold fronts come by. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, maybe you'll like my other video. You can also click right here to help support fin fishing in this channel. I will see you guys tomorrow.